All right, more news about governments. So the Philippines had an election recently, and it turns out that the Marcos Duterte ticket won. Now, you might recognize some of those names, and Duterte is his daughter. It's not Rodrigo Duterte. But Marcos is Bongbong Marcos, as in the son of the fairly recent dictator. And the thing that's interesting about this victory of theirs, one, it kind of shows that there is some level of interest in seeing the Dutertes remain in power. Now, there are constitutional limits about how long people can stay in power. They can only serve one 6-year term. But, you know, the fact that someone with a Duterte last name was able to win, was able to be on a winning ticket, shows that the population isn't inherently opposed to, to Duterte. Now, she was a mayor beforehand as well, so it's kind of important to know that she's not coming out of nowhere. She does have some political experience. Even, her entirety of her political experience is not the fact that she's tied to her father, who was the president. She does have independent political experience as well, for better or for worse. But the thing about Marcos, and it's interesting because in order for him to win, people either had to forget or willingly put out of their mind what the Marcos family did to the Philippines. And if you don't know, there's a lot of things, but the Marcos family were essentially dictators that squandered the wealth of the people and built themselves lavish palaces. And I mean, essentially, they were the Louis XIV of the Philippines. And in fact, once they had fled afterwards, and people finally got to get a look of the amount of wealth that was being hoarded, I mean, you watch the videotapes, it looks like the Chateau de Versailles in there. It's really crazy how much. And, there people are kind of looking through it for the first time after they've successfully led a revolution against the Marcos family, and people are just appalled about the grotesque amount of wealth that is in one place, this one particular palace. So, and by the way, he was essentially he ruled through the military, so not great overall, right? Bad for the economy, bad for civil liberties and freedoms and things. And people eventually toppled the Marcos family, and most of the Marcos is left. Now, Bongbong Marcos, who is the dictator's son, essentially came back, and him and his family essentially started a very long process of changing the way people thought about his family's regime. And by the way, this is something that happens in lots of cultures where bad people from the past are rehabilitated either by the media or by their own influence, or there's some way people want to use the fragility of the human memory to change history in a sense. And the Marcos family has done just that. In fact, Al Jazeera ran a story recently where they weren't interviewing the kids. They were asking the kids about the Marcos dynasty, not dynasty, the period of Marcos dictatorship. And the children, now mind you, it was very simple terms, but they were talking about, like the Philippines did well, and martial law was good for the Philippines, and the Marcos family brought economic prosperity to the Philippines, and none of those things are remotely true. But truthfully, when you undertake a long process and you can use your influence and power to fundamentally change the way people remember history, or learn about history for those who don't remember it. By the way, you see this happen all over the world. It's not just the Philippines, right? There's an active rewriting of U.S. history going on right now, but in U.S. schools, right? So, people with certain agendas will do essentially whatever they can do to get back into the good graces of society. And the Marcos family through decades was able to do just that. And now we will have a Marcos regime again back in the Philippines. Who knows what he'll do with it? Rodrigo Duterte was quasi-dictatorial in his and authoritarian in his term in the Philippines, starting the infamous drug war and bragging about killing people and motorcycles and all sorts of horrors that were led in the Philippines. But people weren't inherently opposed to that. It seems, especially looking at the fact that a Duterte was on the winning ticket, and in combination with a Marcos, who, I mean, in some ways is emblematic of military rule. It looks like in some ways the people of the Philippines are at least somewhat interested in this. So it's just a fascinating turn. But the reason I wanted to talk about this is because this is how fascism rises generally, right? You use your influence to change the way that people think about things. And this is not just in the Philippines, it's going to happen literally anywhere, right? And so if you're able to manipulate enough people over a long enough period of time, you can essentially get them to believe just about anything, right? I mean, one of the more famous lines that George Bush penned was about how if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes a truth. But unfortunately, that observation is correct. The Bush administration kept talking about how Iraq had WMDs over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, despite the fact that it was very obvious that there were no WMDs there and that many people had said so. But when you kept repeating it over and over and over again, people started to think, oh, I wonder if there are WMDs in Iraq, right? Should we be invading? Should we be preventing our own destruction by this invasion? The famous line was, I don't want the evidence. Condoleezza Rice said, let the evidence not be a mushroom cloud or something along those lines, right? She was fear mongering about Iraq nuking the United States, which improbable. Even if they had those kinds of weapons, there's no way they'd be able to reach us at 6,000 miles away at least. It was a profoundly incredulous lie. But as Goebbels wrote, if you're going to, it was either Goebbels or Hitler, I think it was Goebbels. If you're going to lie, make it a big lie, right? And so in some ways, the bigger the lie, the more preposterous the posturing, the more likely it is that people will start to question when it's repeated over and over again, right? This is, by the way, part of the same people that people get hooked on conspiracy theories is either because there's an ounce of truth there, or it's so bombastic that it couldn't be made, that it doesn't seem like it could be made up, or other similar things. The way that humans interact with the world is fundamentally fragile. And the way that we remember events is also fundamentally fragile. And if we are easily influenced, and this is one of the things when I was in law school, we were talking about witness testimony. Witness testimony is a strange thing, just given what we know about the human mind, because you can be influenced so easily. Even people having conversations with you can alter your perception of reality. There's a great little video that you can watch. I believe it's a basketball game, and there's a basketball game going on. You're asked to watch the ball, and you're watching the ball so intently that you don't notice that someone wearing a gorilla costume walks across the screen. So, but that happened. You witnessed it. You saw it. You just didn't perceive it, right? Because your brain was focused on something else. So we are, as humans, are inherently bad witnesses to our own personal histories and to history in general. So people take advantage of that to rewrite history in ways that they think are going to make them look a certain way. And that's problematic, because once you get a narrative out there, once you convince people of a particular thing and you keep drilling it in their heads over and over again, it doesn't really matter what the truth is, because you've gotten people to perceive of it in that way, and you've essentially used your ability, your influence, to make history something new, and then people act on that, right? So Hitler is a particularly good example. I know. Don't jump to Nazis, and I did, and I talked about other things too. But Hitler was particularly good at this because he talked about there being kind of a greater Germany, and essentially convinced people that there were Germans out there that needed protecting, and that Germany was doing the right thing by invading the Sudetenland and all those other things. It's not just Hitler, of course. The Lega Nord in Italy. Now, they are not inherently fascistic, but they have very strong right-wing tendencies. But they essentially created this idea of La Lega Nord in northern Italy. It was a concept that never existed. There was never a northern league in Italy of states, of republics. It never existed in all of history, but an enterprising politician created a flag and a national anthem and a history and sold it to people, and eventually they repeated it so many times that it became true in some ways, and the party became a significant force in Italian politics, and I believe in some ways it still is. So what we're seeing happen in the Philippines, and what we've been seeing happen in the Philippines, isn't unique to the Philippines, but it reminds us that, well, it reminds us a couple things. One, and as I've said a number of times during this episode, democracy is fragile, right? And the institutions and the beliefs that keep it together are inherently fragile. Two, this recasting of history is possible anywhere because of the fragility of the human interaction with memory and history. And three, this is why we need a strong press. This is why we need strong educational institutions to teach people what really happened. Because if you don't, if there is no check by the people or the press or educational institutions to the narrative that governments put out there and that influential people put out there, you can have anything be true. And what becomes true and what is not true is essentially subject to the whims of the leader. And this is true in a number of places, outside of there as well. I mentioned Italy, I mentioned the Philippines, North Korea, excellent example, right? So anyway, the long and the short of it is that we have to be really careful when thinking about how, as a society, we remember things, how we learn from history. And one of the reasons history is important as an academic subject, and just for people to know in general, is because, as the old saying goes, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And it's true. There's no way to process what has happened in the past and to use that to guide your future if you don't understand or didn't actually learn what happened, right? And so, we need strong institutions who can push back, who can create, who fight against narratives, who can enlighten people as to the facts. And sometimes the facts aren't nice. Sometimes the facts are ugly. Sometimes they make people or institutions or things look bad. But we should prefer to have discomfort with our history than to not know it at all, and to allow enterprising politicians. I don't know why I'm struggling with that. Enterprising politicians tell us the sweet nothings that we want to hear to make us feel good, and then ultimately use that trust that we place in them for very bad ends, including and up to the destruction of democracy and those institutions that we have held dear this entire time. Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.